So we're gonna go over some things that you can do with students to teach them or help them practice using their question and answering skills. And when we're done with that one, we're going to go into how to structure a public forum class and how to kind of scale it up from, novices who have zero debate experience all the way up through your most advanced debaters. I'm going to try to let you go as close to 12:15 as possible, because Ashton mentioned that for lunch, some of you with children are needing to get away a little bit earlier. But I can't, I went through, and while Dylan was doing his, to shorten some of these lectures for you. But I'm worried about the structuring a class one because there's so much I want to talk about. But if you need to leave early because you have a child or a family that needs your attention, obviously feel free to step out. You're not going to offend me or anyone else. Also, we are recording these. So you can get the recording to see whatever you missed, which will probably mostly just be questions that other people have. So please feel free to step away if you need to at any time. I'm used to college students who are in and out of my classroom for the entire day. So it doesn't, on Zoom, it won't bother me to see names popping in and out. I'm used to it. All right. My computer's just running slow, as we all learned yesterday. Does not like running Windows for some reason. Or not Windows, Zoom. So if you took the winter sessions with us, a couple of these will be similar or the exact same for some of the ideas of how to do it, but there are also new ones and a couple of things that we're going to talk about that we didn't talk about if you were here for the winter session. So first things first, with teaching Crossfire, the most important thing is you want to get the students working on listening to what they're hearing and asking a question based on what they hear or what they've read. So one of the really fun ones, and usually I have fun names for the activities, this one I don't, that the students seem to actually really love once they get used to it. It takes a couple times of practice with the kids, and then they pick it up very quickly, and they love playing this one, is where you have the students write a story about whatever they want, as long as it's classroom appropriate, obviously. They can have as many details or as few details as they want, whatever, and they can write for a specific amount of time. When everyone's done writing, the teacher picks up all the stories, mixes them up, hands them back out randomly. And then at the same time, the students flip the paper over that they got. They can read through the story one time, then they have to flip it back over upside down, and they can't look at it ever again. This also works on them really practicing remembering what they're reading. They're reading comprehension, which can be something that can be very difficult without practice, especially in a foreign language. So this is another way you can also bring that skill in of reading comprehension in English. Or you can do this in Chinese with any other classes too, obviously. Then once everyone's read, you'll randomly call on a student. They will come up to the front of the classroom. They will retell the story. And then they, once they have completely retold the story, they will, the class will then ask questions about that story. and the student has to answer the question. The key thing being the student cannot contradict what the story says or any of their answers. So if the story, for example, did not give a name to a character in the story, and someone asks a name, the student does have to give a name and be like, oh, well, the character's name is George. They have to keep it George through the rest of the time. So someone was like, can you remind me what the character's name was? And they're like, Jill. They lose. And the goal of the game is to see how many questions the individual asking or answering the questions, how many can they get right in a row? Usually they top out at about 10 to 15. I did have a couple of students one time make it to 20. And if a student successfully made it to 20, I kind of just called it off and stopped it because it would just get too long and the students asking questions would run out of questions. And then I always turn it into some kind of silly competition. I always have some kind of very small reward. And when I say small reward, I'm talking like something that is $1, an American dollar, so 30 new Taiwanese dollars, or less. So a very small candy bar, glow sticks are really popular with kids in the United States. Anything small for whoever answers the most questions correctly. And that really gets them also, when they're asking questions, to ask more complicated questions or more tricky questions, like what you want in Crossfire, and gets them really thinking about using strategy in Crossfire. So rather than just asking for the person to repeat the story, right? They're asking for more detail. They're asking for more clarification about what is involved in the story. I've had students write specific stories where they would put in a number with a bunch of zeros and would know how many zeros they wrote. And then when the student, whoever got their story, the first question would be, how many zeros were in that number? And the student would have to answer. And if they didn't have it right, they lost. So the students, they get really creative with this one. They really enjoy the storytelling one. Any camp I do, I have all sorts of students from, so in the United States, we usually do labs because numbers will be too big to keep everyone together in one lecture room. And I will have other lab leaders coming to me asking me about, what is this storytelling game? Can my kids play with yours? Because the kids love it and they talk about it at lunch and stuff. So it's a really fun one, really easy one to play. If you're like, I need something for today to fill in, or, just whatever. So it's really easy, really fun. You can, adapt the rules however you want to fit the level of your students. This one, Crossfire Capture the Flag, is a lot of fun. Every group I have used it for in the United States has loved it. Here in Taiwan, when we were asking the kids at the end of the sessions, what was one of your favorite activities? Every class that I worked with, a couple of kids would always say, we loved playing Crossfire Capture the Flag. Obviously, this one only works in person. I have not figured out a way to play this online yet. It only works in person. And I also like to do it outside because students so often are just sitting in their classrooms for, hours on end. So getting them outside is a lot of fun. But if the weather is really rainy or cold or really hot, obviously you don't want to play outside. So you split the students into 2 teams. If you want to get really complicated, I've done up to 4 teams before. They each get something to represent a flag. You can use Post-it notes. You can pull, use pencils. It doesn't matter. Anything that's like as long as it's identifiable as what the student is actually looking for. So I use little Pokemon figures. One time I lost my Pokemon figures that I had in my backpack, so I just gave them random things out of my backpack to hide. It doesn't matter. And so you just set, the boundaries of where they can go, and each team takes turns hiding their flag wherever they want. Usually I tell them they cannot dig holes. They cannot put it in anything that's disgusting, because, the objects will be used again. And then after both teams have hidden, they take turns asking one question at a time to find where the flag is hidden. So the first team would ask a question about the location of the flag. Then they get however much time. I usually give them about a minute or less to look in the area for the flag. If they don't find it, it's the next team's turn to ask a question about the location of the other team's flag. And you just go back and forth. What's a lot of fun with this one is this one teaches strategy very, very well, because what you'll see that happens every time, it doesn't matter where I'm at when I teach this, when I use this activity, they'll first ask, is it on the left half or the right half of the field or of the area? And I'm like, that doesn't really narrow it down much. And they figure that out I don't say that, but that's my thought in my head. And, after a couple of questions, they're like, oh. And so they'll start asking, what tree is it closest to? What object in the classroom is it closest to? Is it above or under something? And they'll get really smart questions. And after we play the game a couple of times, I will ask the students, okay, what does this teach us about asking and answering questions in Crossfire? And why is also where you hide your object is strategy as well. Why does that matter? And how does that relate to writing your constructive cases for your debates? And they can really put the concepts together in their head really quickly this way. And then also this game is a lot of fun to use as an incentive if you're having a hard time getting them to focus or do something. You'd be like, all right, look, if y'all will do this assignment for this long, at the end of class, we'll play a quick game of capture the flag. And usually the students will respond very positively to that, because they love to play the game, that they will buckle down, get the work done so that they can play that activity because they enjoy it so much. So this is one I always play. Okay, so those are games you can play. A couple of ways to coach Crossfire that's a little bit more really focused in on Crossfire is doing extended Crossfire. So regular Crossfire is only 3 minutes. But when you're practicing in the classroom, practicing as a team, Crossfire can be as long as you want it to be, or as short as you want it to be. I love one of the things of the schools that I was working with as they were practicing for the non-policy national tournament and the regional tournament this year. What they would do is they would double the Crossfire time and make the students ask and answer each other's questions for double the time that they were going to have to during regular time, because it made the students really dig into the evidence, really dig into the arguments, and come up with really good questions. The other thing that you can do is, make it a game of which side can stump or get the other team to make a mistake first that would, harm them in the round. And, if they win, then you switch teams and you can have new ones. You can do extended crossfire. This is a really good one after you have written, or your team has written, the pro and con constructive cases. And that way they can each read them, they know what the arguments are, and then they can just go back and forth asking questions for as long as you want. One of the things that you can do also in this one is if the students start rambling on, and I found that this is especially true for English as a second language students universally, so in the United States and here, is their question will get really, really, really long. It will be technically one sentence. Like if you were to type it out, it would have commas and everything. It would be one sentence, but it makes no sense because it's so long. And so I will stop the student. I'll be like, nope, you can't ask that question, too long. And I'll make them stop, and I'll stop time. They have to think and then shorten it up until the question makes more sense. And then until I'm like, okay, that's a good question to ask. Yes, ask that one. I'm restarting time. And that gets them really working through it. I also ban during extended crossfire or practice crossfire. I do not allow the students to ask a "do you agree, would you say" question. And I always tell them, and Dylan mentioned this, it's because debate is not get everybody to agree to things. So as your opponent, I'm never going to say yes, never going to agree with you, because it's not my job. My job is to always disagree with you. So if they start a question with "do you agree," I'll be like, nope, can't ask that. And they go, oh, and they have to re-ask the question. So that's extended crossfire. It works really well because it gets them having to think of how do I ask different questions, because they can't repeat questions as well. So then just coaching crossfire, there's a couple of things you can do. So we talked about how in the United States, the public forum topic changes about every month or two, depending on the time of the year. It's closer to every 2 months than every month. And so you could have crossfire as brainstorming when you get a new topic. So as you're coming up with ideas of what could we talk about, right? You can start asking questions just based on the resolution that you're given. And, kind of make a list of all the questions. And then that you can use that list to then go do research and see if you can answer the questions that you came up with. Another one is, and I like doing this with my students, I will do crossfire. They have to I crossfire with them, or I'll do cross-examination with them if they're my policy students. And the goal for them is to beat me, because I love asking questions and asking really tricky questions. And trying to catch the students in traps. And they like to do the same thing to me. And so they love it if they can beat the coach. I've had, even my senior students are like, can I crossfire you or cross-examine you? Or can you cross-examine me? And they love to be able to try to beat the coach. The other thing is that the questions that I'm asking really come sometimes more from a judge perspective than from a debater perspective. And so they get insight into how might the judge be thinking about the debate, and how do they need to answer that and be prepared for those types of questions, or how can they rewrite or add some stuff or take some stuff out of their constructive cases to better fit what judges' brains are also thinking. The next thing with crossfire is a lot of times there's this kind of, the hive mind or group think where questions become focusing on big concepts or ideas that debaters think are really important. And the debaters start leaving the judge out of the round. And so that's another time where you as the judge asking the students questions and making the students answer your questions and writing down your questions is a really good way to break this repetitive habit that students will fall into of asking very similar questions all the time. This is also, as Dylan was talking about, a really good way to get the judge to pay attention to Crossfire or cross-examine. I will admit, if I'm sitting in Crossfire or any cross-examination and the students just start saying, can you explain this again? Can you repeat this again? I tune out. I have it all written down. I don't need to hear this again. And so, but if the students are asking really smart questions, I'm like, oh. And sometimes the kids will ask questions that I didn't even think of. And I'm like, oh, that's a great question. You should be asking that. Smart. And so then I'll pay attention to Crossfire and I'll be really pulled into Crossfire, which is always good for their points, right? Like I'm willing to give them more points when they can keep my attention and everything like that. So you asking the students questions is a really good way to get them to practice, or having them ask you questions and you answering those questions based on the the pro or the con case. That also works because sometimes as adults we will think of tricky answers to what they think is a very straightforward question. You're like, well, and they're like, no. And so it starts to help them see different layers to their contentions that they maybe didn't see at the beginning, and see how, if they're having problems answering a certain question, you answering it can also help them be like, oh, okay, I see how that works. And then they can practice doing that as well. Okay, so that is Crossfire. What questions do you have about teaching Crossfire or how to, or anything like that? What questions can I answer, or about any of the activities as well? Are there any concerns about how to teach Crossfire or to help your students get better at cross-examination or Crossfire that I could maybe answer as well? You can type them or say them. Either one works for me. Claudia, that's a really good question. It depends how you want to do it. Sometimes making one just the answerer and one just the answer, or one person asking questions and one answering, is really good to just sit there and just like hammer them to make sure they understand what they're arguing. If you want to practice with like extended Crossfire, the going back and forth is, I would definitely have them keep going back and forth. One side asks and answers, the other side and back and forth like normal Crossfire. In practice, either way is fine. It kind of depends on what you're wanting them or what they want to work on. If you need to practice going back and forth, or if they just need to practice being on one side of it. But in regular Crossfire, yeah, the pro team would ask the con team a question, con team would answer it, then the con team would ask a question, the pro team would answer it, and then back and forth for 3 minutes. Other questions? Is there a guideline to write their story? I let them come up with any story they want. I tell them it has to be something that they would be willing to read to their great grandmother. So it has to be that appropriate for the classroom. Something that would not make their great grandmother go, oh, I can't believe you said that in public. if you want, you could always be like, okay, your story has to be about a trip to Mars, right? Like you could vary it up as much as you want with the storytelling game. It's completely adaptable. It's whatever you want it to be.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Yeah. Coach, you just said that you don't want your student to say, "Do you agree?"
Mhm.
During their crossfire session.
Correct.
Then, what would you recommend? How a better expression during crossfire?
So that's a great question. So the thing is, and I teach my debaters this too. If someone asks a question that starts with, do you agree or would you say, I tell my students just say no. Because the next question is going to be why. And there's always an exception to a rule, right? Or an exception to a thing. So is death always bad? No. If that's why we have euthanasia for pets rather than making them suffer. We will put them down so that they can have a better death, right? So stuff like that. And if someone says, do you agree all death is bad? I would just go, no. So when a student starts out with, do you agree? I always just stop them and I say, no, you can't ask those questions. And I will say, what are you wanting to get them to say? And if they're like, well, I want them to say that death is a really bad thing in most cases. Like, okay, well, how can you re-ask that question without saying, do you agree? And I'll make them actually write it out, because usually if they write it, it helps them to process what they want to ask. And I make them, keep making it shorter and shorter until it makes sense and the question actually gets to a point. Does that help, Howard?
So, so usually, the debater will ask yes no question
Mm-hmm.
to their opponents.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And so you could say, is death always bad? And let's say the person says no. You could be like, okay, can you give me an example of when death is not bad? Right. And that's what Dylan was talking about with reasonable follow-up questions, is you could ask that yes, no question, then be like, may I have a follow-up? Blah, blah, blah. Wendy, is there anything particular the debaters need to focus on in the grand crossfire compare? Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, so in my opinion, yes. So the first and second crossfires, the first crossfire should really be ensuring that the students first understand what each other's cases are. What are the constructive cases? Second, starting to find the holes in that argument so that their partners in the rebuttal speeches can start pointing out those holes and those problems. So that should be, and then the second crossfire should be narrowing the debate. So if you think about debate in deductive logic, which is where we go from something very big to something very small, the crossfires should keep narrowing the debate down to just a couple of issues. So by the grand crossfire, it should really be comparing the worlds of the pro team and the con team and looking at those impacts. So with social media, you could think of it as, why is freedom of speech more important than freedom from harm or something like that? So that, you're really showing the judge, okay, we started out with our resolution, which is really broad. Then we came in a little bit and then we asked questions, and we're getting down to really what are the main points in this debate. You don't want to, keep asking the same questions that you already asked, because by grand crossfire, if you're still asking questions about the constructive speeches, you're probably behind the debate. Does that help, Wendy?
Yes. So just to make sure, because this is something new in the public
Mhm.
forum because yeah, in policy or non-policy, we often have like one or two. So the basic principle is to narrow things down, right?
Yes.
So in the grand crossfire, because we will learn about what are the contentions that
Mhm.
the opposite side will be focusing on in their summary. So we just focus on those and
Yes.
try to poke holes on those and maybe strengthen our own contentions. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes, 100%. That is exactly what you should be doing.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Great question. Okay, next question. If the students have no idea what to ask, oh, that's great. What can we do to help the kids do questions? And then also, can the same or similar questions appear in different rounds of Crossfire? Okay, so answer first of what do you do if the student goes, I don't know what to ask? A couple of things. The first thing I do is I always make students look at the resolution and make a list of at least 5 questions they could ask, and they have to write them down and have them with them. 5 questions they could ask no matter what the other team talks about. Because any resolution is really, really broad. You can always come up with anything. So the NTNU topic about the English proficiency exam, some of the students that they would stay after class and ask me some questions were having problems being like, we don't know what to ask. And I said, okay, here's your task for the next week before I come back is to write out 5 questions each that you could ask no matter what. And then we'll go and we'll come together as a team and we'll talk about those questions so I can help you. And so that's what I do. That way, if they get hit with something they didn't predict, they at least have what are known as general questions. Other things that are always go-to questions, if your brain just has stopped and cannot think of something to ask, is, can you explain your first argument under contention 1 in your own words? Right? So make sure that you tell you say in your own words. That way your opponents don't just stand and try to reread what they already said. It's like, I heard your speech, right? Especially if they're reading evidence cards like what Anthony showed us yesterday, right? Can you explain those in simple terms? And that makes it look to the judge, not that you weren't paying attention, but that you're really trying to make sure that the other team understands what they're saying. Even if you're like, I totally know what they're saying, but I don't have any other questions. The other reason I'll say ask, can you explain whatever in your own words, is because sometimes when they start talking and giving that answer, you'll be standing there and you'll come up with a question. And I remind students that it is absolutely okay to take notes while your opponent is answering a question. So if they make an answer and you come up with another question, make a quick note to yourself so you don't forget when it's your turn to ask that question again. And so that's kind of an easy way to hide I don't know what I should be asking. And it's also the easy way to get, your very novice debaters who are just terrified of having to ask questions to at least say words during Crossfire. And so that they can learn that Crossfire is not that scary. So can the same or similar question, well, first, does that answer your question about like, how do we help students when they're like, I have no idea what to ask? Does that answer help there? Awesome. Okay. Second question is, can the same or similar questions appear in different rounds of cross-examination? Okay. Yes, but, capital but. Rather than just continuing to ask a question that you're not getting an answer to, It's better in your speech time, so either in the rebuttal, the summary, or even in the final focus, to just be like, listen, we asked our opponents for this information. They won't answer the question, or they are not giving an answer to the question. They're trying to avoid it. Therefore, you should not believe this argument because, and then, you know, all of your reasons why the argument is wrong. Because you don't want to, if an opponent's not going to answer a question, or if they're not going to give you what you want in that question, asking the question over and over isn't going to help, right? So you may as well just move on. And just bring it up in your speech of like, look, I asked, their answer was blah, and that's not good enough. So you should not believe, judge, you should not believe this argument, and you should not vote on it. Does that make sense? Does that help? Yay, no, or would you like more information on? Okay, awesome. All right. What other questions about cross-examination before we move into structuring public forum, or structuring, really honestly, debate class? Any other questions?